Nora had lived on Maple Street for only 4 months, but she already knew one thing very well. Every night, at the same time, a small, warm light appeared in the window of the old bookstore across the road. It was not a bright light. It was not a shop sign. It was only a little lantern, soft and golden, standing near the glass. But every evening, when the street turned blue and quiet, that light appeared. Nora always noticed it. She was 25 and worked in a busy office in the city center. Her days were full of screens, meetings, messages, and noise. By the time she came home, she was often too tired to cook anything more than noodles or soup. Maple Street was quieter than the rest of the city. There was a flower shop, a bakery, a narrow cafe, and the old bookstore with green wooden frames around the windows. The bookstore was called Rowan Books. It looked like a place from another time. Its window was never crowded. There were only a few books, a wooden chair, and every evening, that small lantern. One rainy Thursday, Nora came home later than usual. The street was wet and shining under the lamps. Wind pushed the rain against her coat, and she hurried toward her building. But before going inside, she looked across the road. The lantern was there again. Warm, still, quiet. For a moment, Nora stood in the rain and looked at it. She did not know why, but it always made her feel a little less alone. The next morning, on her way to work, she passed the bookstore and saw the owner for the first time. He was an old man, tall but slightly bent, with silver hair and a long, dark coat. He was placing a box of books near the door. Nora slowed down. Then, without planning to, she asked, "Excuse me, do you own the shop?" The man looked up and smiled. "I do," he said. "At least, I try to." Nora smiled a little. "I live across the street. I always see the lantern in your window." The old man glanced back toward the shop. "Ah," he said. "Yes. I light it every evening." Nora hesitated. "It looks beautiful." "Thank you," he said. "That is kind of you." She thought he might explain more, but he did not. He only picked up another box and said, "Have a good day." "You too," Nora replied. All day, she kept thinking about the lantern. Why did he light it every evening? Was it for customers? For himself? Or was it simply a habit? A few days later, a storm came. The wind was strong, and by evening, the whole street was full of moving branches and flying rain. Nora was making tea in her apartment when the power suddenly went out. The room went dark. She stood still for a moment, listening to the wind outside. Then she walked to the window. Most of Maple Street was dark, but across the road, in the bookstore window, there was still a small golden light. The lantern. Nora stared at it. She smiled without meaning to. Then she thought of the old man in the shop alone during the storm. Without thinking too much, she put on her coat, took a flashlight, and crossed the street. The bell above the bookstore door gave a soft sound when she entered. Inside, the shop smelled of paper, dust, and tea. The lantern stood in the window, glowing softly. Near the back of the store, the old man was lighting 2 candles. He looked up in surprise. "Oh," he said. "You're from across the street." Nora nodded. "I just wanted to check if you were all right." The old man smiled gently. "That is very thoughtful of you. I'm fine. A little dark, perhaps, but fine." Nora laughed softly. He pointed toward a chair. "Since you are here, would you like some tea?" The kettle was still hot before the power went out. She almost said no, but the storm outside was loud, and the bookstore felt warm. So she said, "Yes, I'd like that." The old man introduced himself as Mr. Rowan. He poured tea into 2 old cups and sat across from her at a small wooden table between the shelves. For a while they listened to the storm. Then Nora said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you light the lantern every evening, Mr. Rowan did not answer at once. He looked at the little golden light in the window. Then he said, "Many years ago, my wife used to come home late from the hospital where she worked. We lived upstairs then. I always put a lantern in the window so she could see, from the end of the street, that she was home." Nora was quiet. "Mr. Rowan smiled, but it was a soft and tired smile. She said the light made the whole street look kinder. Nora looked toward the window too. "Does she still live here?" she asked. Mr. Rowan lowered his eyes. "No," he said. "She died 6 years ago." Nora felt the same quiet pain she sometimes felt when people spoke gently about loss. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded. "For a long time after she died, I thought about stopping. But one evening, I lit the lantern again, and I realized something." He folded his hands around the warm cup. "What did you realize?" Nora asked. "That a light can still mean welcome, even if the person you once waited for is gone." The storm moved against the windows. Nora said nothing. Mr. Rowan continued, "Some people pass by and smile. Some people look up at the window. Some people, perhaps, feel less alone for a minute." Nora looked down at her tea. Then she smiled a little. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think that happens." From that evening on, Nora began stopping at the bookstore more often, sometimes only for 10 minutes, sometimes longer. Mr. Rowan never asked too many questions, but he listened well. He remembered small things. He remembered that Nora did not like very bitter tea. He remembered that Fridays were her hardest workdays. He remembered that she once said she missed rainy afternoons in her hometown. In return, Nora learned small things about him. He had owned the shop for 40 years. His wife had loved poetry and old maps. Every Sunday morning, he dusted the shelves from left to right, always in the same order. And every evening, just before dark, he lit the lantern. As autumn became winter, Nora found herself hurrying home not just for her apartment, but for Maple Street, for the bakery smell, for the quiet bookstore, for the little light in the window. One evening she arrived and found Mr. Rowan sitting behind the counter, looking pale. "Are you feeling all right?" Nora asked at once. He smiled weakly. "I'm only tired." But he did not look only tired. The next day the bookstore did not open. Neither did it open the day after that. On the third evening, Nora stood at her window and looked across the street. The window was dark. No lantern. The street felt colder than usual. She waited another hour, then finally crossed the road and knocked on the door beside the shop. After a moment, Mr. Rowan opened it. He looked surprised. "Nora, you didn't open the store?" she said. "And the lantern wasn't there." Mr. Rowan gave a small, tired laugh. "You noticed both." "Of course I noticed." He opened the door a little wider. "I've been unwell. Nothing serious, the doctor says. But I need rest." Nora stood quietly for a second. Then she asked, "Would you like me to help with the shop for a few days?" Mr. Rowan blinked. "You already have your own work." "I know," Nora said. "But I can come in the evenings. And maybe on Saturday." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "My wife would have liked you very much," he said. That week, Nora opened the bookstore after work. She straightened chairs. She put returned books back on the shelves. She made tea. And every evening, just before dark, she lit the lantern in the window. The first time she did it, she stood back and looked at the little golden light. Suddenly she understood. It was a small thing, but it changed the whole room. And maybe, she thought, it changed the street too. A few regular customers came in and asked about Mr. Rowan. An old woman bought a book of poems and said, "I'm glad the light is back." A teenage boy stopped at the window and smiled before walking on. A mother and daughter came in only because, the little girl said, the lamp looked friendly. When Nora told Mr. Rowan these things, he laughed softly. "You see," he said, "your city is less lonely than you think." By the time he was stronger again, winter had already arrived. On the evening he returned to the shop. Nora stood beside him as he lit the lantern once more. The street outside was blue with cold. The glass reflected shelves, books, and warm light. Mr. Rowan looked at her and said, "Some lights begin as memory." Nora waited. "And then," he said, "they become something new." That night, when Nora crossed back to her apartment, she turned around at the door and looked once more at the bookstore window. The lantern was glowing softly behind the glass. But now it no longer felt like someone else's light. It felt like part of her life, too. And for the first time since moving to Maple Street, Nora no longer felt that she was only living near the street. She felt that she belonged to it.